When I accidentally walked into my stepson's room that evening, I was completely unprepared for what I saw. The air was thick, charged with something I couldn't quite name, but it was undeniable. My breath hitched as Brandon turned to face me, his eyes wide with surprise, his expression unreadable. It was only a moment, a fleeting fragment of time before I stammered out an apology and shut the door. But that moment, it changed everything. The day had started innocently enough. My husband, David, was away on one of his frequent business trips, leaving me alone in the house with Brandon, his 22-year-old son from his first marriage. Brandon had come home for the summer after finishing his junior year at college. He was polite but reserved, and while we'd always gotten along well enough, there had been a natural distance between us. He wasn't the type to share much, and I wasn't the kind to pry. But lately, something had shifted. Brandon seemed different, more present, more attentive. At first I thought I was imagining it. He would linger in the kitchen while I cooked, offering to help chop vegetables or wash dishes. He'd ask me about my day, his questions genuine and thoughtful. And then there were the glances, subtle but lingering, like he was trying to figure something out about me, or maybe himself. That day, the house was quiet. I was in the living room, curled up with a book, when I heard a strange noise coming from upstairs. It wasn't loud, just a muffled thump, followed by a pause. I hesitated for a moment, then set the book down and climbed the stairs. "Brandon?" I called softly, knocking on his door. There was no answer. I frowned, my hand lingering on the doorknob. I didn't want to invade his privacy, but what if he was hurt? The motherly instinct I didn't realize I had kicked in, and I turned the handle. The door opened just a crack, enough to reveal Brandon standing by his desk, his back turned to me. He was shirtless, his broad shoulders tense, his hand moving quickly to shut his laptop screen. The glow from the monitor cast a faint blue light across the room, and I saw his chest rise and fall as he let out a sharp breath. "Sorry, I didn't mean to..." My words tumbled over themselves as Brandon whipped around to face me. His face was flushed, his expression caught between embarrassment and something else, something I couldn't name. "It's fine," he said quickly, his voice steady but soft. "Just next time, can you knock first?" Alex winced. I nodded, my face burning as I shut the door. My heart was racing, though I couldn't explain why. I told myself it was just the awkwardness of the situation, nothing more. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Dinner that evening was quiet. I tried to shake off the encounter, focusing instead on chopping vegetables and sautéing chicken. Brandon joined me in the kitchen, his presence both a comfort and a challenge. He leaned against the counter, watching me work. "Need help?" he asked, his tone casual. "No, I've got it," I replied, keeping my eyes on the cutting board, but I could feel his gaze on me, warm and unrelenting. "You're a really good cook," he said after a moment. "Dad's lucky." I laughed softly, brushing off the compliment. "It's just chicken and veggies, nothing special." "No, I mean it." His voice was sincere, almost too sincere. "You take care of him, of this house, of everything. He's lucky to have you." I paused, my knife hovering above the cutting board. There was a weight to his words that caught me off guard, a depth I hadn't expected. When I glanced up, his eyes met mine, and for a second, the air between us felt electric. "Thank you," I said finally, breaking the silence. "That means a lot." He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "It's true." Later that night, I couldn't stop thinking about the way he had looked at me, the way his words had lingered in the air. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I was reading too much into things, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I went to bed early, hoping sleep would clear my head. But as I lay in the dark, my thoughts kept circling back to Brandon, to the way his voice had softened when he spoke to me, the way his eyes had held mine. And then there was that moment in his room, the tension, the unspoken understanding. It was as if we'd crossed an invisible line, one we couldn't uncross. The next morning, the atmosphere in the house was different, lighter, somehow, but also charged with unspoken words. Brandon was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, a cup of coffee in hand. "Morning," he said, his smile easy and warm. "Morning," I replied, pouring myself a cup of coffee. I tried to act normal, but I could feel the awkwardness creeping in around the edges. Sitting down would feel strange, knowing that moving into this had been the first thing to start scaring me. "About last night," he began, and my heart skipped a beat. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable." He laughed. I looked at him surprised. "You didn't," I said quickly. "I mean, it was my fault. I shouldn't have just walked in." "Oh," he shook his head. "No, it's okay. I don't want things to be weird between us." "They're not," I said, though my voice faltered slightly. "We're fine." He smiled again, and for a moment it felt like the tension had lifted. But as the day went on, I realized that something had shifted between us. Something I couldn't quite define, but that I knew I couldn't ignore. Brandon came down the stairs as I was pouring 2 glasses of water. He was freshly showered, his damp hair curling slightly at the ends, and he wore a simple t-shirt and jeans. Yet something about him seemed different, more grown up, perhaps. Or maybe I was just seeing him differently. "Smells good," he said, breaking the silence. "It's just spaghetti," I replied, forcing a smile. "Easy and quick." "Still," he said, pulling out a chair and sitting down. "You're always taking care of me, even when you don't have to." The comment caught me off guard, and I glanced at him as I set the glasses on the table. There it was again, that weight in his words, that depth that seemed to reach beyond the surface. "You will be all right." "It's not a big deal," I said, sitting down across from him. "Your family. Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low and gentle. "I'm fine," I said automatically. He didn't look convinced. "You seem, I don't know, off." I hesitated, unsure how to respond. "I guess I'm just tired. Your dad being gone so often, it gets lonely sometimes." The words slipped out before I could stop them, and I immediately regretted them. But Brandon didn't seem surprised. If anything, he looked almost relieved. "I get that," he said. "I mean, I see how hard you work to keep everything together. For him, for me, and I just want you to know that I see you." I blinked, taken aback by the sincerity in his voice. "You see me?" "Oh, thank you." He nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Yeah, I do. And I think you deserve more than what you're getting." My heart thudded in my chest, and I felt an unsteady warmth spread through me. His words were dangerous, not because of what they meant, but because of how they made me feel. Seen, appreciated, wanted. "I appreciate that, Brandon," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. But, wait, but what? He pressed, his tone gentle but insistent. But this is complicated, I said, forcing myself to look away. You're my stepson, and I'm married to your father. He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. I know. I guess I wanted you to know how I feel, even if it's messy. The days that followed were a delicate dance. Brandon and I tiptoed around each other, careful not to spend too much time alone together. But even with the space, the tension remained, crackling in the air like static electricity. I found myself questioning everything. Was it just my imagination, or was there something real between us? And if there was, what did that say about me, about my marriage? One evening, about a week after the initial incident, I decided to confront the elephant in the room. David was still away, and Brandon was in the backyard, tossing a basketball through the hoop mounted on the garage. I watched him from the kitchen window for a moment, gathering my courage, before stepping outside. Hey, I called, my voice tentative. He turned, the ball still in his hands, and smiled. Hey. I walked over to him, my heart pounding. Can we talk? Sure, he said, setting the ball down and leaning against the garage. What's up? I hesitated, unsure how to begin. About the other night. And everything since then. I think we need to clear the air. He nodded, his expression serious. Okay. I don't know what's happening between us, I admitted, my voice shaking slightly. But whatever it is, it has to stop. This tension, this connection, it's not okay. His brows furrowed, and he looked down at the ground, kicking at a loose pebble. I know, he said after a moment, but I can't just turn it off. I've tried. Brandon, I began, but he cut me off. I know it's wrong, he said, his voice rising slightly, but I can't help how I feel, and I don't think you can either. I opened my mouth to protest, but the words caught in my throat, because he was right. As much as I hated to admit it, I couldn't deny the pull I felt toward him. It was wrong, and I knew it, but it was also real. I was matched for him. We have to figure this out, I said finally, because this can't go on. He nodded, his expression pained. I know. That night, as I lay in bed, the weight of our conversation pressed down on me like a heavy blanket. I knew what I needed to do. I needed to put some distance between us, to reestablish the boundaries that had been blurred, but the thought of pulling away from Brandon felt like cutting off a part of myself. When I finally fell asleep, my dreams were restless, filled with fragmented images of him, his smile, his voice, the way he looked at me like I was the only person in the world. When I woke the next morning, the sun streaming through the curtains, I felt a sense of resolve. I couldn't let this go on, not for my sake, and certainly not for his. That day, I threw myself into chores, trying to stay busy. I cleaned every room in the house, did load after load of laundry, and even tackled the overgrown flower beds in the backyard. By the time evening rolled around, I was physically exhausted, but emotionally no closer to a solution. Brandon was in his room when I knocked softly on the door. Come in, he called, his voice muffled. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. He was sitting on his bed, his laptop open on his lap, but he closed it quickly when he saw me. Hey, I said, my voice tentative, can we talk? He nodded, setting the laptop aside. Yeah, what's up? I hesitated, unsure how to begin. I think I need to take a step back, I said finally, from this, from us. His brows furrowed, and for a moment he didn't say anything. Then he nodded slowly. I understand. He finally said, "Do you?" I asked, my voice breaking slightly. "Because this isn't easy for me, Brandon, but it's the right thing to do." "I know," he said quietly, "but that doesn't make it hurt any less." I nodded, tears stinging my eyes. "I'm sorry." "Me too," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I left the room, closing the door behind me, and leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath. The distance was necessary, but it felt like I was ripping my heart out. "Hey," he said, his voice soft. "Hey," I replied, my heart beating a little faster at the sound of his voice. For a moment we sat in silence, the only sound the faint chirping of crickets in the yard. I could feel him watching me, but I kept my eyes fixed on the horizon, unsure if I could trust myself to meet his gaze. "I know we're supposed to be, giving each other space," he said finally, breaking the silence. "But I feel like we need to talk." I turned to look at him then, his face illuminated by the warm glow of the setting sun. He looked older somehow, more serious. "What is there to talk about?" I asked, though my voice lacked conviction. "Everything," he said, leaning forward slightly. "You can't just pretend none of this happened, Lauren. I know you feel it too." I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. "Brendan." "Please," he interrupted, his tone urgent but gentle. "Just let me say this." I nodded reluctantly, bracing myself for what was to come. "I've never felt this way before," he said, his voice low and earnest. "Not about anyone. And I know it's wrong. I know this shouldn't be happening. But I can't stop thinking about you. I don't want to stop." His words hit me like a punch to the chest, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that this was all a mistake. But the words wouldn't come. "I don't expect you to feel the same," he continued, his eyes searching mine. "But I needed you to know. Because pretending like this doesn't exist is driving me crazy." "Brandon," I began, my voice trembling. "You don't understand how complicated this is. Your father, Dad doesn't see you," he said, cutting me off. His tone wasn't angry, but there was a sharpness to his words. "He doesn't appreciate you the way you deserve. I see how lonely you are, Lauren. I see how much you give and how little you get in return." I shook my head, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. "That doesn't make this okay." "I know," he said, his voice softening, "but I can't help how I feel." Neither could I, though I didn't dare admit it. Instead, I looked away, focusing on the fading light of the sunset. "This has to stop," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "For both our sakes." He nodded slowly, his expression pained. "I'll try," he said. "But it's not going to be easy." "Nothing about this is easy," I replied, my chest aching with the weight of my words. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as the events of the evening replayed in my mind. I knew I had done the right thing, but it didn't feel like it. It felt like I was tearing something beautiful and fragile apart before it even had a chance to grow. The next morning I woke early, determined to push past the haze of the previous night. I decided to go for a run, hoping the physical exertion would clear my head. The crisp morning air was refreshing, and for a while I managed to lose myself in the steady rhythm of my feet hitting the pavement. But when I returned home, Brandon was in the kitchen, pouring himself a cup of coffee. He looked up when I walked in, his eyes widening slightly as he took in my flushed face and damp hair. "Morning," he said, his voice tentative. "Morning," I replied, grabbing a bottle of water from the fridge. There was a beat of silence before he spoke again. "You went running?" "Yeah," I said, taking a sip of water. "I needed to clear my head." He nodded, his gaze lingering on me a moment longer than it should have. "You look good." I felt my cheeks flush, and I turned away, pretending to rummage through a drawer. "Thanks." The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Brandon and I were caught in a loop, circling the same unspoken truths without ever truly addressing them. I told myself it was only a matter of time before David returned and the dynamic shifted back to normal. But deep down, I wasn't sure if anything would ever be the same again. Then I heard it. That evening, as I was folding laundry in the living room, Brandon walked in, his hands shoved into his pockets. He hesitated in the doorway, his expression conflicted. "Can I help?" he asked, nodding toward the pile of clothes on the couch. I shook my head, my hands continuing to move mechanically. "I've got it." He didn't leave, though. Instead, he sat down on the edge of the couch, watching me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "I've been thinking," he said after a moment. "Maybe it's better if I go stay with Mom for a while." The words hit me like a slap, and I froze, a shirt clutched in my hands. "You don't have to do that," I said quickly, my heart racing. "I think I do," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Being here, it's too hard for both of us." I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but I knew he wasn't. The tension between us had become unbearable, a constant reminder of everything we couldn't have. Maybe space was the only way to break free of it. "Okay," I said finally, my voice trembling, "if that's what you need." "I know." He nodded, his jaw tightening. "I think it's what we both need." The rest of the evening passed in a blur, the weight of his decision hanging heavy in the air. When I went to bed that night, the house felt emptier than it ever had before. The next morning, Brandon packed his things and left without much fanfare. I stood on the porch as he loaded his bag into his car, my heart aching with every step he took away from me. "Take care of yourself," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he turned to face me. "You too," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, then got into the car and drove away, leaving me standing there in the morning light, feeling like a part of me had gone with him. He drove, it soft and loose, the taillight shining on his face, until all I could do was watch. David called one evening, his voice crackling over the phone. "How are things going?" he asked, his tone casual. "How's Brandon?" I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. "He decided to go stay with his mom for a while," I said finally, keeping my voice as steady as I could. "Oh," David said, sounding surprised. "Did something happen?" "No, nothing like that," I lied. "He just thought it would be good to spend some time there before the summer ends." One evening, as I was flipping through channels on the TV, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. I glanced at the screen and froze. It was a text from Brandon. "Hey, just wanted to check in. Hope you're doing okay." My heart leapt at the sight of his name, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to ignore the message, to maintain the distance we'd agreed was necessary. But another part of me, stronger, more insistent, needed to connect with him, even if only for a moment. "I'm doing okay," I typed back, my fingers trembling slightly. "How about you?" His reply came almost instantly. "I'm all right. Just miss talking to you." I stared at the words, my chest tightening. I missed talking to him too, more than I could admit. But what good would it do to say that? What good would it do to reopen a door we'd worked so hard to close? He squeezed my hand, his fingers trailing over my skin for a long moment. "I miss talking to you too," I replied before I could stop myself. It was the truth, and as much as I wanted to deny it, I couldn't. There was a long pause before his next message came through. "Do you think we made a mistake?" The question hung in the air, heavy and loaded. I didn't know how to answer it. Had we made a mistake? Or was the mistake letting things get as far as they had in the first place? "I think we did what we had to do," I wrote, though the words felt hollow. He didn't reply right away, and I wondered if I'd said the wrong thing. But then my phone buzzed again. "I understand. I hope you know how much you mean to me." Tears welled up in my eyes as I read his words, and I quickly wiped them away, grateful that no one was around to see me falling apart. "You mean a lot to me, too," I typed back, my hands shaking. "But we have to let this go, Brandon. It's the only way." He didn't reply after that, and I set my phone down, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. I knew I'd done the right thing, but it didn't make it any easier. The weeks continued to pass, and slowly the ache began to dull. I threw myself into my work, taking on extra projects and volunteering for tasks I would have normally avoided. It helped to a degree. The busyness kept my mind occupied, leaving less room for the thoughts that threatened to pull me under. "Okay," I said finally, forcing a smile. "Where were you thinking?" "Somewhere warm," he said, his own smile warming his face. "Maybe a beach. Just relax and unwind." He licked his parted lip. I nodded, though my mind was already racing. A trip might be exactly what we needed, or it might be the thing that revealed just how broken we truly were. The trip came together quickly, and within a week, we were boarding a plane to the Caribbean. The resort was beautiful, all white sand and turquoise water, the kind of place that looked like a postcard come to life. For the first few days, I let myself get lost in the beauty of it all, allowing the sun and sea to soothe some of the tension that had been weighing on me. David seemed more relaxed too, and for a while, it felt like we were rediscovering a piece of what had drawn us to each other in the first place. We laughed over drinks by the pool, held hands during walks on the beach, and even danced under the stars during one of the resort's evening events. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. But even in those moments, Brandon was never far from my mind. His absence was a shadow that lingered, a reminder of the connection I'd felt with him that I couldn't find with David. I knew it wasn't fair to compare them. They were two different people, two different relationships. But the contrast was impossible to ignore. On our last night at the resort, as we sat on the balcony overlooking the ocean, David reached for my hand. "I know I haven't always been the best husband," he said, his voice low and filled with emotion. "But I want to be better. I want to try." Tears pricked at my eyes, and I squeezed his hand, grateful for his honesty. "I want that too," I said, though my heart ached with the weight of everything I wasn't saying. As we sat there watching the waves crash against the shore, I wondered if it was possible to start over, to rebuild something that had been so close to falling apart. Only time would tell. When we returned home from the trip, there was a subtle shift between David and me. The resort had offered us a brief reprieve, a glimpse of the connection we once shared, but the return to reality brought with it the familiar weight of unresolved issues. David threw himself back into work almost immediately, and I found myself once again navigating the quiet spaces of the house alone. Brandon had stayed away, true to his word. I hadn't heard from him since our brief text exchange weeks earlier, and while I knew it was for the best, the silence between us felt unbearable at times. I thought about him often, too often, wondering how he was, if he missed me, if he had found a way to move on. One evening, as I was tidying up the living room, I found one of Brandon's old sweatshirts draped over the back of a chair. I hadn't noticed it before, tucked away beneath a throw blanket, and the sight of it hit me like a punch to the chest. I picked it up slowly, my fingers tracing the worn fabric, and for a moment, it felt like he was there with me, his presence lingering in the air. Before I knew it, tears were streaming down my face. As I stepped inside, the bell above the door chimed softly, and I was greeted by the warm hum of conversation and the clink of ceramic mugs. I ordered a cup of tea and found a seat near the window, gazing out at the fading light as I tried to quiet the thoughts swirling in my mind. I was halfway through my tea when the door opened and a familiar figure walked in. My heart stopped. Brandon. He hadn't seen me yet, his attention focused on the barista as he placed his order. He looked good, better than I remembered. His hair was a little longer, and he seemed more at ease, more confident. I watched him, my heart pounding, torn between the urge to run and the overwhelming need to stay. When he turned around, his eyes scanned the room, and the moment they landed on me, he froze. For a second, neither of us moved, the air between us charged with something electric, something unspoken. Then, slowly, he made his way over to my table. "Hey," he said softly, his voice tentative. "Hey," I replied, my own voice barely above a whisper. "Do you mind if I sit?" he asked, gesturing to the empty chair across from me. I hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Of course." He sat down, setting his coffee on the table, and for a moment we just stared at each other, the weight of everything that had passed between us hanging heavy in the air. "It's been a while," he said finally, breaking the silence. "Ja," I said, my throat dry. "It has." "How have you been?" he asked, his tone careful, as though he were afraid of saying the wrong thing. "I've been, okay," I said, though it wasn't entirely true. "What about you?" He nodded, his gaze steady. "I've been managing. It hasn't been easy." I looked down at my tea, my hands trembling slightly as I wrapped them around the warm mug. "I didn't expect to see you here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Neither did I," he said, a small rueful smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I guess it's one of those weird coincidences. You remember what happened to Burton's the night before last in the city?" He shook his head, though I wasn't sure if I believed in coincidences anymore. We fell into an uneasy silence, the air between us thick with everything we weren't saying. Finally, Brandon leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. "I've been thinking about you," he said, his voice low but steady. "A lot." My breath caught, and I looked up at him, my heart pounding in my chest. Brandon. I know, he said quickly, holding up a hand. I know it's complicated. I know we're not supposed to feel this way, but I can't pretend it's not there. He smiled, as if saying for her. For a moment, I let myself imagine what it would be like to give in, to stop fighting, to let myself feel the way I wanted to feel. But the thought was too dangerous, too overwhelming. I pulled my hand away, my heart aching. This isn't fair, I said, my voice breaking. To you, to me, to your dad. I know, he said, his expression pained. But what are we supposed to do? Just pretend this doesn't exist? I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. I don't know. I don't have the answers, Brandon. He nodded slowly, his jaw tightening as he fought to keep his emotions in check. I don't want to lose you, he said, his voice raw. You're not losing me, I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. We need time, space, to figure this out. He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes searching mine. Then he nodded, his shoulders slumping slightly. Okay, he said quietly, if that's what you need. I nodded, though the words felt hollow. It's what we both need. As I watched him leave the coffee shop, a wave of emotion crashed over me. Sadness, longing, relief, and something else I couldn't quite name. I knew we had done the right thing by parting ways again, but it didn't make it any easier. And as I drove home that night, the empty seat beside me felt heavier than ever. The weeks that followed felt like navigating a fog, where every step forward felt unsure and heavy. The encounter with Brandon at the coffee shop lingered in my mind, replaying in vivid detail whenever I found myself alone with my thoughts. His voice, his touch, the look in his eyes. It was all too much, and yet I couldn't let it go. David's routine was as steady as ever. He worked late, came home tired, and spent his evenings either on the phone or lost in the glow of his laptop. The fleeting warmth we'd shared on our trip felt like a distant memory, overtaken by the familiar rhythm of detachment. I told myself I should be grateful for his predictability, for the way he anchored our life, but instead I felt increasingly untethered. I found a bench near the edge of a small pond and sat down, watching the ducks glide across the water. The stillness was soothing, but it did little to quiet the turmoil inside me. I hadn't told anyone about what had happened with Brandon, not my friends, not even my sister. It was a secret I carried alone, and some days the burden felt unbearable. I was lost in thought when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, my breath catching when I saw Brandon's name on the screen. The name Brig left the back of my thoughts and replaced it with his. Instantly. Hey, are you free to talk? I stared at the message for a long moment, my heart pounding. I knew I should ignore it, that responding would only complicate things further. But the truth was, I wanted to talk to him. I needed to. At the park, I typed back before I could second-guess myself. By the pond. His reply came quickly. I'll be there in 15 minutes. I put my phone away, my hands trembling. What was I doing? I knew this was a bad idea, but the thought of seeing him again filled me with a strange mix of dread and anticipation. When Brandon arrived, he spotted me immediately, his tall frame cutting through the late afternoon sunlight. He walked over, his expression a mix of relief and apprehension, and sat down on the bench beside me. Hey, he said softly, his voice warm but tentative. "Hey," I replied, unable to meet his gaze. For a moment, we just sat there, the silence stretching between us. Then he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and spoke. "I wasn't sure if you'd want to see me," he admitted. "I wasn't sure either," I said honestly, my hands fidgeting in my lap. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the ground. I felt my chest tighten, the familiar ache returning. "Brandon, this isn't fair to either of us." "I know," he said, his voice low, "but I don't know how to stop. I don't even know if I want to." Dave. I turned to look at him then, my eyes searching his. "You have to try. We both do." He let out a soft, bitter laugh. "You say that like it's easy." "It's not," I said, my voice breaking, "but it's the right thing to do." He sat back, running a hand through his hair. "Why does the right thing always feel so wrong?" I didn't have an answer for him. All I knew was that the path we were on was unsustainable, a collision waiting to happen, and yet I couldn't bring myself to walk away. We stayed at the park until the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. As the light faded, Brandon turned to me, his expression raw. "I just need to know," he said, his voice trembling. "Do you feel the same way I do?" I hesitated, my heart pounding. Part of me wanted to deny it, to protect both of us from the truth. But the weight of my feelings was too much to bear. "Yes," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I do." The admission hung in the air between us, heavy and undeniable. Brandon exhaled, his shoulders sagging, as though a weight had been lifted from him. "Then why can't we?" "Because we can't," I said, cutting him off. "Brandon, this isn't just about us. It's about your dad. It's about everything we'd destroy if we let this happen." He nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "I know, but it doesn't make it any easier." "No," I said softly, "it doesn't." As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I stood, brushing off my hands. "I should go." "Lauren," he began, but I shook my head. "Please," I said, my voice trembling, "let's not make this harder than it already is." He stood too, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored my own. "Okay," he said quietly, "I'll let you go. For now." I nodded, tears stinging my eyes as I turned and walked away. I could feel his gaze on me, heavy and unrelenting, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. If I did, I wasn't sure I'd have the strength to keep walking. That night, as I lay in bed, the events of the day played over and over in my mind. I had finally admitted to myself and to him what I had been trying so hard to deny. And while the truth brought a fleeting sense of relief, it also left me with an overwhelming sense of loss. I knew what we had to do. I knew there was no future for us, no way to reconcile the feelings we shared with the reality of our lives. But knowing didn't make it any easier. If anything, it made the ache even more profound. I stared at the ceiling, the house silent around me, and wondered how I had gotten here. How a simple, accidental moment had unraveled everything I thought I knew about myself, about my marriage, about love. And as I closed my eyes, the only thing I could see was him. The days blurred into each other, each one feeling heavier than the last. I told myself over and over that I had made the right decision at the park, that walking away from Brandon was the only way to preserve what little semblance of normalcy I had left. but the ache didn't lessen. If anything, it grew sharper, more consuming. David, as always, remained oblivious. He came and went from the house, his focus entirely on work. I sometimes wondered if he could sense the growing distance between us, but if he did, he never let on. We fell into our usual patterns of polite conversation and shared meals, each of us occupying our own separate worlds.